Hey guys, today we're talking about distortion. Some time ago I stumbled upon a plugin from JMG Sound called Cyberdrive. They market it as a Swiss Army knife or desert island distortion plugin. And honestly, that's kinda true. In this context, the closest thing that comes to mind in terms of purpose and functionality is FabFilter Saturn. The difference, of course, is the price. At the time of recording this video, Cyberdrive goes for $93 while Saturn is $139. I'm not sure how often JMG runs sales, but I'm pretty confident it's way more often than FabFilter. Personally, I grabbed Cyberdrive at launch for $16, which is absolutely worth it in this case. So let's compare them and see if Cyberdrive can actually replace Saturn as a workhorse. I also noticed that there are barely any decent tutorials on this plugin, explaining all its many sections properly, not even from the developer. I'm sure this scares off and confuses a lot of people, so I decided to dig into it myself and show you everything. I honestly didn't plan to make the video about this plugin that long, but at some point I realized it's clearly getting out of hand. And I'm sure nobody's gonna see through me twisting knobs for half an hour straight. So I figured it'd be better to split it into two parts, that way everyone gets some time to digest the info, think it over, and of course have a perfectly legal excuse to take a break and watch some cat shorts. So yeah, this is part 1, let's go! So, there are 3 identical modules that allow you to combine different distortion types. Pretty cool decision that can lead to some interesting results. They say the plugin has 64 types of distortion, but in this video we'll only cover the core modules that actually matter for mixing, because half of them, in my opinion, are more suited for sound designers and composers. The main parameters are: mix, controls the dry-wet balance, obviously. Drive basically adds more distortion or saturation. Control. This one's interesting. According to the manual, it changes the character of the distortion, and the behavior differs depending on the model. It could be changing beat depth, a wave shape or curve, a filter inside saturated feedback, bias offset, and a bunch of other stuff. I think the settings inside the module are the most important, so let's go through them. AGC enables automatic gain compensation. To my ears, sometimes it behaves a bit weird, but to be fair, the manual clearly states that it constantly measures input loudness and compensates output to match, which means it can affect dynamics, so it's safer to just set static gain manually using the out control. Clip enables a hard clipper at the module's output, preventing peaks above 0 dB. HP pre and LP pre let you place filters either before or after the distortion stage. And the most interesting part here, the filter modes. One of them is filter, a simple high-pass, low-pass, everything outside the set frequencies gets filtered out. And multi, a multi-band crossover, where everything outside the set range just passes through as a dry signal. The advantage of the second one is huge. For example, you can distort everything above, say, 300 Hz on a bass guitar while keeping everything below untouched. That basically puts this plugin on the same level as Saturn. As for the filter mix parameter, it's not even mentioned in the manual. I didn't test it myself, and honestly I'm already happy with just those 2 modes. But if you know what it does, drop the comment, let us all know. The most important one for us is probably the classic module. Let's go through it in detail. Alright, let's start with the simple one, clean op-amp. Op-amp means operational amplifier. They are used everywhere, in guitar pedals, in studio gear, basically most classic pedals and pro audio electronics are built on op-amps. Examples: pedals, TS808 and TS9, Boss OD1 and SD1, Red, MXR Distortion Plus, Klon, etc. Studio gear, console buffers, line amps, compressors and EQs. They clip when pushed, usually symmetrically. In Cyberdrive, the clean op-amp is presented as a studio clean op-amp saturator with a very soft knee, low THD and no strong filtering. Perfect for subtle warming on bass, vocals or even the whole mix bus. Here's the interesting part. In Cyberdrive, there's a dedicated clean op-amp module. In real hardware, you almost never hear the sound of just the op-amp alone. It always goes with diodes, transformers or tubes. But here, developers made a clever move. They let us hear the op-amp by itself. And that's very handy, because you can take that clean, transparent character and then blend it with anything else in the next module, in the same plugin. For example, put a tube module or Germanium after it and you'll get a unique combo. And by the way, it can still get quite dirty, but it's probably called clean simply because it can be used on its own, isolated from tubes or transformers. That's why CyberDrives gives us 3 identical modules in series. It's also meant for experimentation. You can literally build your own virtual distortion chain like you're designing custom hardware. Next up is worm tape. This is your typical magnetic tape, not any specific Studer or Rampex model, but more like a generalized portrait of tape saturation. Slight compression of transients, smoothing of highs, and harmonic enhancement in the lows and mids. I guess you pretty much already know what it sounds like. If you've ever run audio through a reel-to-reel machine, or more likely tried some tape emulation plugins, you'll know the effect. The sound gets thicker, smoother, and kinda more glued together. Best uses: on drums to add weight and glue, on bass if you want to round out the attack and add density, on groups or even the master bus when you need to gently glue the mix. One note though, like most things in this plugin, even tape here isn't super subtle. It's definitely on the noticeable side. Now, Fat Tube. This is more of a generic tube distortion. It's probably closer to a Culture Vulture style studio saturator or a tube preamp, rather than something like a Voxbox or UA610. Those usually give warm coloration, while this plugin version is more aggressive, so again, not subtle. It definitely alters the signal. It boosts mids, rolls off highs, and makes the sound thick and fat, but less airy. It is more on a destructive side. From what I've noticed, Fat Tube cuts both highs and lows, so it's too destructive for transparent saturation, but as a parallel blend, it's really cool for adding mid-range presence. Here's what I got when blending it with drums and vocals. Analog fold is quite an unusual type of distortion based on the wave folding effect. Unlike classic soft clipping, where picks are just smoothed, a wave folder literally folds the waveform back into itself once it passes a certain threshold. This type of circuit wasn't really common in guitar pedals, but rather in analog synths of the 70s and 80s, where wave folders were used to create complex timbres out of simple sine waves. I'm not 100% sure, but as far as I know, this principle was also indirectly present in some classic guitar amps, like Marshall Plexi, early Mesa Boogie, Fender Basement preamps. In Pro Studio gear, it wasn't really applied directly, but in synth culture it became a classic trick. Sound-wise, it gives a bright, harmonically rich saturation with a kind of rough texture and extra movement. Best use cases: synths, pads, experimental parts where you want added harmonics in motion. On guitar or vocals it can sound a bit too experimental, but for electronic genres and sound design it's a powerful tool. Now, as you heard, when blended in, it works pretty well to add some density and glue to the drums in the mix, while also taking away some of that extra harshness from the hi-hat. Dirty diode is a classic diode clipping, one of the earliest and most widespread ways to create distortion. The principle is simple: the signal runs through diodes that chop off its peaks once the threshold is reached. Unlike soft clipping, this produces a sharper, more aggressive cut. This approach is at the heart of countless pedals, from the Proco Ret to the Boss DS1 and even early fuzz boxes, where diodes shaped that iconic dirty sound. That Ret similarity is probably why I liked it as a gritty musical distortion for bass guitar. The sound is edgier, with a spectrum full of odd harmonics. It doesn't preserve dynamics much, but it instantly delivers a thick hard drive. Best for electric guitar, synths and bass when you want an aggressive gritty tone. These are basically two different fuzz flavors, not tied to any one specific device. Fuzzy Transistor points back to the very first transistor fuzz pedals of the 60s. These were based on regular silicon transistors, which pushed the signal into heavy nonlinearity. That's how legendary pedals like the Maestro FZ1 and early Big Muff came about. Compared to diode clipping, transistor fuzz has a much hairier texture, with tons of overtones and chaotic artifacts. In pro audio, transistor fuzz wasn't a thing. This is purely a guitar thing. Best uses: electric guitar, synths, psychedelic rock, stoner, grunge. On vocals or drums, it's usually too destructive, but as a special effect, it can add crazy character. Gritty Germanium takes us back even further to when fuzz pedals of the 60s used germanium transistors. Germanium is an older semiconductor material, predating silicon. Its transistors were unstable, highly temperature dependent, and produced a soft, flowing distortion. But that very imperfection made them legendary. Pedals like the Fuzz Phase, Rangemaster Treble Booster, Tone Bender Mark II were all germanium based. Sonically, germanium fuzz is different from silicon, softer, sandier, more compressed, while silicon is harsher and brighter. In Cyberdrive, gritty germanium is an attempt to capture that unstable vintage hairy tone. Best applications: vintage-style guitar parts, garage bass tones, retro-flavored synths. In studio gear, germanium appeared in old preamps and also in 1950s radio equipment, but it became iconic through guitar pedals. Finally, we have soft clip. This is probably the most classic form of distortion. It mimics the soft limiting of a signal, which historically appeared not only in pedals but also in consoles and tape machines. In guitar culture, this is the foundation of legendary overdrives like the Tube Screamer or Boss OD1, where diodes in the op-amp feedback smoothed peaks and gave the tube-like crunch. But soft clipping goes way beyond pedals. You could also hear it in consoles when you pushed the inputs a little hard. The signal stayed musical, dynamics were preserved but with a nice coloration. And here's the cool part. Since tape and tube modules also do clipping in their own way, Cyberdrive gives us soft clipping in a vacuum, a universal soft clipper. It bends the picks, adds harmonics, but without tube or tape coloration. Very similar to diode circuits and pedals or early op-amp overdrives. Sound-wise, it is smooth saturation. Quiet notes pass clean, louder ones get harmonics and a bit of thickening. That's why soft clip works not only on guitar, but also on drums, bass, vocals, and even on the master bus, if you just need to tame picks a little while keeping things alive.